Okay. I'm guilty of saying a lot of this is my favorite, but passage one and passage two really is. I love passage one and passage two because it makes so much sense. The other interesting thing is that if you have a moment and you look at the answer key here in this book, you will see a great thing about passage one and passage two. There's three different ways that College Board looks at these questions. So the first, they'll give an E for an easy question. They'll give an M for a moderately difficult or a D for difficult. All the difficult questions hold a little more weight and a little more value. Those are the ones that are going to, if you get them right, they're going to push you up over that edge. So that edge of, the 500 to the 600, the 600 to the 700, the 700 to the upper 700s. So if you're wondering how the people are, getting those higher scores, it's all about getting the difficult questions correct. And passage one and passage two is where the lion's share of difficult questions are found. And that's why I love them so much, because I'm about to show you how to get them right every single time. All right, so passage one and passage two is like this. As always, we never want to sleep on this part. You always want to read this part. It's going to give you the best hint and the best background knowledge to understand the passages. So in this one in particular, passage one is adapted from Henry David Thoreau, Resistance to Civil Government, originally published in 1849. So this is Thoreau. So what I have to do is as I'm reading, I have to understand what Thoreau's theme is, and the topic is going to be civil government. So I'm keeping that right there. Passage two is adapted from Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from Birmingham Jail, from copyright 1986 by the estate of Martin Luther King. Thoreau wrote at a time when slavery was legal in the United States. In 1963, King was arrested while protesting racial segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. He wrote this letter while in jail. All right, so the thing to think about for passage one and passage two is that there's going to be a topic that they are both addressing. In this case, civil government. We haven't read it yet to really understand, but we're getting these clues from this little area right here. The author of passage one is never going to agree with the author of passage two about how to get here. So there's always going to be a strife. There's always going to be a disagreement. There's always going to be an argument. Those are very, very important words. And you need to identify what is the argument on Thoreau with regard to civil government. What is the argument for Martin Luther King Jr. with regard to civil government? And on this one, I do write it down. I do read it, and I do write down my theme, because I often reference it when I'm at the questions. I often have to look back over and remind myself. You'll probably catch me when we get to the questions, but I do have to look back over often to make sure that I have a good understanding of what Thoreau's argument is towards civil government and what MLK's argument is towards civil government. So before we begin reading, I want to give you another hint from someone who considers herself a pretty good reader. I am 46. I have been vigorously reading for many, many years. It was one of my favorite things to do as a child. It is still one of my favorite things to do as an adult. I love, love, love reading. I love reading anything. If anybody gives me anything to read, it will get read. With that said, when I'm reading passage one and passage two, I often don't understand what is going on. There's no background knowledge. So I'll start with passage one. I'll give this information, start to just try and figure out what I'm reading. I'm going to read passage one, but here's my little, the truth serum. I don't really ever understand what's going on in passage one until I'm almost done with it. And then a light bulb clicks and I'm like, okay, I understand what he's saying. And as soon as I understand what he's saying, I get up here and write it. But if you are like me and you start reading and in your head you're like, I have no idea what he's talking about. I still have no idea what he's talking about. Okay, I'm going to try to focus and I'm going to try and figure out what this guy's talking about. It's okay. It's very normal. In fact, it's so normal that the writers of your test here think that most kids are going to struggle through passage 1 and then skim through passage 2. And here's how I know that. Line 22 is in passage 1. It's one of the first ones. Thoreau makes the point about which people follow their consciousness. Thoreau, passage 1. Which choice provides the best evidence? So we have another question about Thoreau. And then look where we go. We go to passage 2. And the rest of the questions, this one, all these lines are in passage 2. This one is in passage 2. This one is 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 passage 2. So every other kid in the room that you're testing in is going to suffer their way through passage 1, not understand why they just read it, go to passage 2, look at the time, and realize that they've got to make up some time. And they are going to skim their way through it. And you just saw why College Board puts the most amount of points here on this one. That's why. Because they know that you are fatigued, that this is a difficult text. Passage 1 is always going to be a difficult text. If it was easy to read, they might have sucker punched you. Passage 1 is always going to be tough. It's also always going to be longer. And so every other kid in the room is going to suffer their way through passage 1. They might give up in the area where I told you, where I start to understand what I'm reading. And then they will skim through passage 2 because they realize they're running out of time. You're not going to do that because now you know that the questions are coming from passage 2. I am going to pause right now because you're not going to have to watch me read, but I'm going to mark the text just because that's what type of reader I am. I'm going to, read to understand what Thoreau is saying in this passage, and I'm going to read to understand what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying in his passage. I'm going to, keep the idea about what are they saying about government for each, and then we'll come back and we will tackle the questions. I'm really excited to do that with you. So let's read the passage, every single word.